Miss Collier explains!
Area of a rectangle and square.
Today, our learning intentions is to understand what the area of a two-dimensional shape is, and to be able to find the area of squares and other rectangles. We will know we are successful when we can find the area of squares and other rectangles. Today we're going to look at how to find the area of squares and rectangles. Area is the amount of surface inside a plane shape. Now notice that it says plane here, not plane like as in ordinary, but a plane, which means flat. So this is why area relates to two-dimensional shapes, flat shapes. Area is measured in square units. And we'll talk about it later, but we mustn't say squared, we must say square units. And I'll show you why. We call it square units because when we're actually calculating the area of a shape, we're figuring out how many squares can fit into that shape. There are lots of examples of when we would use area in everyday life. The amount of paint that you would need to paint a wall, or the amount of chemical spray that you might need if you're going to spray an entire paddock. You have to figure out the area of your paddock before you could do that. When we're talking about the square units of area, we can be referring to it in many different ways. Just like when we're talking about millimeters, centimeters, all of these can be used as squares of those sizes to measure different areas of shapes. None of these are drawn to scale, but as we can see, each of them is significantly larger than the other. We have 1 millimeter square, which is a square that's 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. This would be used to measure the area of things that are quite small, very small in fact. Then we have 1 square centimeter, a centimeter by a centimeter. This could be your everyday household objects, things that are relatively could be held in your hand. Then we've got a meter squared, which if you think about a meter ruler and then another meter ruler, it's that size. So large things like buildings or ovals, those sorts of things would be measured in square meters. And then lastly, we have square kilometers. So that's a kilometer by a kilometer. Things like countries or cities, large objects would be measured using square kilometers. Before we dive into the formula of finding area, let's look at this rectangle. And as we can see, I've broken it up into squares. And if I count, along the length of it, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have 6 squares along the length and 3 squares going up. So this rectangle is 6 by 3, and I'm going to say that they are centimeters. So I have 6 centimeters by 3 centimeters. So we can see that they split into nice rows and columns. Every row has the same number of squares and every column has the same number of squares. That's going to be the same for any rectangle or square because they are even with those right angled corners, meaning that all of the rows and columns are going to be even. So if I was to take the time to count them up, this is how it would go. Okay, so there's 18 squares. So that's going to be 18 square centimeters. 18 square centimeters. But obviously, counting each square is going to be extremely annoying, especially if we've got really large shapes. We want a rule. So what I could think of is, well, this line has 6, and this line has 6, and this line has 6. So I could just add 6 plus 6 plus 6. That also equals 18. That's an easy way to get to the answer. Now, any of you who've been through grade 1 or 2 would immediately say to me, Miss Collier, addition is the same as multiplication. So if I'm adding the same thing over and over again, I don't need to add, I can multiply. And you are extremely correct. I've got 6, 6, and 6. So that's 6, and how many times do I have that added? That's 3. So it's 6 times 3. And 6 times 3 is 18. So now we've actually created a rule for the formula for the area of a rectangle and squares. We figured out that we can multiply the length by the width, and that will give us the number of squares that make up that rectangle or square. So in this case, it's 18 square centimeters. Now this is where I want to talk to you about saying centimeters squared, which is what a lot of people say. But sometimes if you say 18 centimeters squared, squared means that an action needs to be done. So we need to take 18 and square it, which is times it by itself. So that can get confusing. But instead, what we're trying to say is that there's 18 squares that are a centimeter big. So we like to say 18 square centimeters. Let's look at the formula for the area of a square. Now, because a square is defined as having 4 equal sides, our formula of multiplying the length times the width means we are multiplying the same side by the same side because they're both even. So we could say area equals side times side. Or we also know if you times something by itself, it's squared. So you could say the area of a square is side squared. That is a formula you can use. Now, personally, because squares and rectangles are basically the same for finding area, I prefer to just use the rectangle formula when I'm doing my square, and you're allowed to do that. That's fine. For a rectangle, our formula applies that we just figured out together. We have area equals the length times the width. Let's have a go at finding the area of squares and rectangles. Find the area of this rectangle and square. So first thing we have to do is write out the formula. Now the formula for the area of a rectangle is A equals length times width. Now I'm going to use substitution to replace my letters with the value. In this rectangle, my length is 10. So replacing the length with a 10. Now my width is 4. I need to make sure that they're same units, which they are. They're both millimeters, so we're all good. I'm replacing my width with 4. Now that I've replaced all my pronumerals, I can just multiply. 10 times 4. 10 times 4 is 40. And of course, I need to use my units, which we had millimeters to start with, which means we're going to write millimeters. But now they're not just millimeters in a line, they are now square millimeters. So I need to write square. So I have 40 square millimeters. A handy hint I like to remember is that I know it's going to be a 2 because I've multiplied 2 numbers together. That's going to help you maybe later on down the track when we're doing volume, etc. So that's just something I like to remember. B. B is a square, so I can write area equals side squared, or I could write area equals length times width. It's up to you. I'm going to do the square formula just so you can see how it looks. So I've got to replace my pronumeral. S is the side. The side is 2.5 centimeters. So I'm going to say 2.5 centimeters squared. Now, you are welcome to use your calculator because the point of this mathematics is not for you to be able to show that you can square numbers, but the point is to show you can find area. So you're allowed to use your calculator. I'm going to use mine. 2.5 squared, which is the same as saying 2.5 times 2.5 equals 6.25. Now, units. My units was centimeters, so I'm going to write centimeters, but of course now they're squares. So 6.25 square centimeters. You have a go at finding the area of these rectangles and squares. Let's check your answers. A. Area equals length times width. We're always going to write the formula first. I'm going to keep those equals in a line. Now my length is 8 centimeters and my width is 3 centimeters. They're both centimeters, so we're off to a good start. 8 times 3 is 24. And now I've got my units. My units were centimeters and now they are square centimeters. 24 square centimeters. B. Area equals length times width. My length is 1.5 and my width is 1.5. So I'm going to use my calculator. 1.5 times 1.5 equals 2.25. Now my units is kilometers and they are square kilometers. I hope now you can use the formula area equals length times width to find the area of rectangles and squares.